People assume that because I present as an Omega, I must have wanted to be saved. They are wrong. I am Lee Soobin, second son of Lee Pharmaceutical Group. I hold a doctorate in molecular genetics from KIST. I run my own research foundation with a board that answers to me. I have walked into rooms where men twice my age stood up without being asked to. I have never needed anyone to open a door for me, fight a battle for me, or decide what I was strong enough to handle. I say all of this not out of pride. I say it so you understand exactly how extraordinary it was that I fell in love with Daehyun. And exactly how much it cost. We met at a policy summit in Geneva. I was presenting a paper on Omega-specific pharmaceutical biases in clinical trials. He was there representing HN's strategic holdings at a closed-door defense infrastructure meeting. We ended up at the same dinner. He argued with every single point I made about regulatory gaps, not dismissively, but with the focused intensity of someone who had actually read the research and found it lacking. I pushed back. He pushed back harder. By midnight we had moved to a corner table away from everyone else and were still talking, voices low, neither of us willing to be the first to concede. I went back to my hotel room that night and thought, that man is going to be a problem. I was right. Just not in the ways I imagined. We bonded 14 months later. Voluntarily. Equally. Two families of equivalent weight, two people who had chosen each other with their eyes open. There was no arrangement, no transaction, no obligation. Just the terrifying, inexplicable decision to let someone matter. I knew what I was choosing. A man who ran a private intelligence network. A man whose stillness in a room made other men nervous. A man who had loved one person before me, Kang Seoyeon, heiress to Kang Media, alpha, magnificent and dangerous, and had ended it cleanly 3 years before we met. I knew all of it. I chose him anyway. What I did not anticipate was how differently we loved. Daehyun expressed love like a fortress being built around something precious. Quietly, completely, without asking permission. He rerouted threats before I knew they existed. He restructured decisions without consulting me, not because he thought me incapable, but because in his mind, removing the problem before it reached me was the love. He had been trained since childhood that a powerful man protects. That protection is silent and total. That asking permission is weakness. I experienced it as erasure. I expressed love through presence and friction. I needed to be in the argument. I needed to be consulted, challenged, treated as someone who could handle the weight of a problem, not just the comfort of its resolution. I needed him to bring me the difficult thing and trust me with it. He experienced it as rejection. We had been living in the same house for 2 years and communicating in entirely different languages, and neither of us had noticed, because when it was good between us, it was the kind of good that makes you forget there was ever anything missing. But there were nights. There were arguments. You rerouted my entire grant approval through your legal team, I said one evening, standing in the kitchen, my voice measured but tight. Without telling me, the ministry contact handling your file has been flagged by 3 separate intelligence sources. I wasn't going to let your funding get tangled in that. That was mine to handle, Daehyun. You would have gone through the official channel. It would have taken 6 months and someone would have buried it. I set down my glass. So you decided. For me. Without asking. I solved it. That's not the same thing. He went quiet. That infuriating, sealed quiet that I could never break through. I waited. He said nothing. I went to the guest room. He did not come after me. That was how it went. Not cruelty. Never cruelty. Just 2 people who had never learned to say I need you to do this differently, because we had both spent our whole lives not needing anyone to do anything differently for us. I found out I was pregnant on a Thursday morning in February. I sat in my private clinic's consultation room and looked at the scan image for a very long time. 11 weeks. Helvet. A small, insistent heartbeat on a screen, entirely indifferent to the complexity of the life it had arrived into. I should have called Daehyun immediately. I know that. I have known that every day since. Instead I called my older brother Soo-hyun. Then I told my research director, Dr. Park In-seong, who had been with my foundation for 6 years and who I trusted without reservation. I asked him to quietly adjust my travel schedule. I needed 3 weeks. I needed to hold this privately before it became something managed. I told myself it was about protecting something tender before it became a logistical operation. That was true. It was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I was frightened. Not of the pregnancy. Of needing Daehyun to respond well. Of giving him something to protect and watching him disappear into the protection, and losing the last space where I still existed on my own terms. That fear, I would later understand, cost everything. On the evening I finally decided to tell him, the ultrasound image folded in my jacket pocket, dinner reservation made, the words arranged carefully in my head, a sealed envelope arrived by courier. A gallery preview. A foundation we had donated to for a decade. My name on the invitation, elegant script, nothing unusual. I remember looking at it and feeling nothing except mild inconvenience at the timing. I went. The gallery was beautiful. That is the detail that stays with me even now. Not the fear, not the pain, but how genuinely beautiful that room was. Soft amber lighting. Sculpture positioned between tall windows. The quiet hum of classical music low enough that conversation felt intimate. Around 40 guests, all familiar faces from the philanthropic circuit. Champagne I didn't touch because of the pregnancy. A hostess who greeted me by name. Nothing felt wrong. That is the thing about precision. It doesn't announce itself. I spent 40 minutes moving through the space, exchanging pleasantries, examining a bronze installation near the east wing. I remember thinking I would leave within the hour, go home, and finally tell Daehyun over the dinner I'd reserved. The ultrasound image was still in my jacket pocket. I had touched it 3 times already, a nervous habit, reassuring myself it was real. Then something shifted in the air. Not dramatically. Not like in films where the lights flicker and everyone gasps. It was subtle, a faint sweetness at the back of my throat, like something medicinal dissolved into the room. I noticed it the way you notice a sound that has been present for minutes before your brain registers it as unusual. I set down my glass. Then my legs stopped working. I remember the floor coming toward me. I remember someone shouting my name from very far away. I remember a hand gripping my arm. A server, I think, and then the ceiling, and then nothing for a very long time. I woke up 14 hours later in a private hospital room with Daehyun's hand around mine and blood on his shirt cuffs that I didn't understand at first. The room was too bright. My body felt like it had been wrung out and put back together incorrectly. There was a specific hollow ache low in my abdomen that I recognized before I was fully conscious, because my body knew before my mind caught up. I already knew what had happened. I knew before any doctor spoke. I looked at the ceiling for a long time. Daehyun's grip on my hand tightened slightly, like he felt the moment I returned to awareness. He didn't speak immediately. Neither did I. We stayed in that silence together, the most honest silence we had ever shared, while the weight of it settled over both of us like something permanent. I should have been there, he said finally. His voice was different, stripped of its usual architecture. You didn't know, I said. My voice came out thin. Wrong. I should have known. That's my job. I didn't answer, because part of me, the grieving, irrational, exhausted part, thought, yes, to us. And you didn't. That thought was unfair. I know that now. I did not know it then. My medical team identified the compound within 36 hours. My lead physician came to my room with the toxicology report and explained it in careful, clinical language that I appreciated because I am a scientist and plain facts are easier to receive than softened ones. The substance was synthetic, odorless, engineered to trigger acute uterine hemorrhage in pregnant omegas while mimicking cardiac symptoms as cover. It had been introduced through the gallery's east wing ventilation system. It was not an accident. It was a weapon. And it had been built with enough specificity that whoever designed it had known exactly who would be in that room. Daehyun, sitting in the chair beside my bed, did not move while the physician spoke. I watched his face. He had the particular stillness of a man organizing himself internally while keeping every surface calm. A skill I had watched him deploy in boardrooms, in negotiations, in every difficult situation I had ever seen him face. It was formidable. It was also, in that moment, deeply frightening. Because I knew what that stillness meant. He was already 3 steps ahead of the rest of us. He already had people moving. "Leave us," he said to the physician. Quietly. The doctor left. "Who?" I asked. "I don't know yet." That was the first lie he told me. I didn't know it then. He would tell me later that he said it to protect me, that his team had preliminary indicators within hours, that he needed certainty before he brought me a name. He would explain it with complete logic and I would understand every word of his reasoning. But understanding something and forgiving it are 2 different architectures entirely. Over the following week, I watched Daehyun become a closed room. He came every day. He sat with me. He handled every logistical detail of my recovery with the thoroughness that was simply how he operated. But the investigation, the thing that mattered most to me, the question of who had done this and why, became a wall between us. I asked for updates. He gave me careful non-answers. "Nothing confirmed yet. I don't want you focused on what isn't certain. I am a research scientist. My entire life is built around pursuing what isn't certain." He knew this. "Tell me what they found, Daehyun. When there's something definitive, stop managing me. I am not a variable you can control." "I'm not. You're hiding something. I can feel it." And I could, literally, through the bond, a tension in him that he was actively suppressing. "Why won't you just say the name?" Silence. "You know who it is," I said slowly. "You already know. It's more complicated than. Why are you protecting them?" The word protecting landed between us like something thrown. He went completely still. And in the 2 seconds before he found words, 2 seconds in which his silence read exactly like guilt, something in me made a decision that I could not take back. His history with Kang Seohyun lived in those 2 seconds. Every meeting I hadn't attended. Every closed conversation. The clean, official version of their ending that I had accepted because I had chosen to trust him. I stopped trusting him in those 2 seconds. 3 days later, my own investigator, someone my brother had quietly retained, completely separate from Daehyun's network, delivered a folder to my private office. Inside was a name, Kang Seohyun. Compound sourced to a lab with Kang-linked supply chains. Documented. Layered but traceable. And beneath that, a second document. An intercepted internal communication from the week of my hospitalization. A message sent to someone inside my recovery facility. A nurse placed through a Kang-affiliated staffing agency, someone who had taken my vitals and poured my water and smiled at me every morning. I read it twice. Then a third time. Incomplete. He survived. The second attempt needs to be cleaner. Confirm when he resumes his independent schedule. I sat with that sentence for a long time. Outside my window, Seoul continued being Seoul. Indifferent, relentless, enormous. Inside the room, something finished breaking. There would be a second attempt. Seohyun had already planned for failure. I was still a target, visible and bonded and alive, which meant the hunt was not over. And Daehyun, the man who was supposed to be my partner, who had known her name for days and said nothing, was dismantling her empire quietly, privately, while I recovered in a hospital bed believing he might still be protecting her. I could not stay. I could not explain. I could not trust the person I would have to trust with my life. For the first time since Geneva, I felt completely alone. And somewhere in that aloneness, a decision began to form. I did not make the decision that night. I made it over 3 days, slowly, the way you arrive at a diagnosis you already suspect but keep testing because you need to be certain before you act. I sat with the intercepted message. I read it until the words stopped feeling like words and became something structural. A wall, a verdict, a fact I had to build around. The second attempt needs to be cleaner. Kang Seohyun was not impulsive. I understood that clearly now. The compound alone had told me everything about how she operated, the months of preparation, the precision of the dosage, the cover of a legitimate event, the planted staff member inside my recovery room. This was not a woman who acted from emotion. This was a woman who planned the way architects plan, load-bearing, sequential, accounting for failure before it happened. She had already accounted for my survival. She had a contingency. And I was still exactly where she could reach me. I went back to work 3 weeks after leaving the hospital. Not because I had healed, I had not, but because I needed to think, and I cannot think without motion. I returned to my foundation, reviewed pending research, attended 2 board calls. I performed normalcy with the precision of someone who has something to hide. At night, alone I ran the logic. Staying meant visibility. A living, bonded Lee Soobin, publicly attached to Han Daehyun, was Seoyeon's obstacle. As long as I existed in that position, I was a target. Daehyun was dismantling her empire. I had seen enough fragments of the financial news to understand something large was moving, but dismantling took time. Months. Possibly longer. And a woman who had already attempted murder once, who had a contingency message drafted and a plant inside my hospital, was not going to sit patiently while her assets were stripped. She would move again. The only question was when. But a dead man is not an obstacle. A dead man has no value as a target. If Soobin Lee ceased to exist, publicly, verifiably, with a body and a record and a grief that Seoyeon's own intelligence network could confirm, the hunt ended. She would have won. And winning, for a woman like her, meant stopping. That was the logic. It held up every time I tested it. What shattered the logic, every time, was the other thing. I found out on a Tuesday afternoon, 10 days after leaving the hospital. My private physician called me into a consultation so carefully worded that I knew before I sat down. A secondary implantation. Extraordinarily rare. The compound, precisely calibrated for a confirmed 11-week pregnancy, had not reached what had been, at the time of the attack, too small and too early to register on any scan we'd done. There was a second pregnancy. Barely viable. Fragile in ways that made my physician speak slowly and choose every word. I sat in that room for a long time after she finished. The window faced west and the afternoon light came in at a low angle, falling across the floor in a long pale strip, and I watched it without seeing it. I thought about the first heartbeat on the screen. I thought about the ultrasound image still saved in my phone. I had never deleted it. I thought about what it meant that something had survived. Then I thought about the second attempt. And everything rearranged itself. If I stayed and she succeeded, I died. The pregnancy died. There was nothing left to protect. If I disappeared completely, with permanence, with evidence Seoyeon could verify, the threat dissolved. And something alive, something that had survived against every odd, got to keep surviving. The decision wasn't clean. It was devastating and necessary, and I have never once, in the 5 years that followed, pretended otherwise. I called my brother Soo-hyun at midnight. He listened without interrupting, which is unusual for him. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said. "Soo-hyun." I said, "No. You're asking me to help you die. I'm asking you to help me survive. There's a difference. Does Daehyun get a say in this?" That question sat in my chest like a stone. I breathed through it. Daehyun has been making decisions about my safety without consulting me for weeks. I am returning the favor. Silence on the line. Then, "That's not fair and you know it." "I know," I said. "Help me anyway." He argued for 2 more hours. He covered every angle: legal exposure, psychological cost, the bond, what this would do to Daehyun. I let him argue because he needed to, and because every point he made was valid, and because I had already considered all of it and arrived at the same place regardless. He helped me. Because he is my brother. Because when everything else is stripped away, that is what brothers do. The staging took 11 days. A medical cadaver, arranged through a forensic colleague who owed our family a debt that had never been formally named. A coastal location north of the city. A vehicle, a record, a sequence of events that would reconstruct cleanly under investigation. Soo-hyun handled the documentation. I handled the medical details because I am a scientist, because precision was the only form of control I had left. I did not say goodbye to Daehyun. I could not. If I had seen his face, I would have told him everything, and then we both would have died. The night before, I opened my phone and typed a message I never sent. "I need you to know that I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because something alive was more important than something explainable." I'm sorry I couldn't trust you with this. I think that failure was mine as much as yours. I hope you find something to do with all that silence someday. I deleted it. Then I deleted the phone and put it in the river. Then I sat in a car at the edge of the city and pressed one hand flat against my abdomen. A quiet, private acknowledgement to the small, fragile thing that had survived what should have ended both of us. Hold on, I thought. Not a prayer exactly. Something more stubborn than that. Then I drove north and did not look back. Not once. Because if I had, I would have turned around. And turning around would have killed us both. Gang Nong smells like salt and cold pine. That was the first thing I noticed when I arrived. Not the unfamiliarity of the streets, not the weight of what I had just done, but the smell. Clean and indifferent. A city that did not know my name, did not know my family, did not know that 3 hours north a man was about to receive the worst phone call of his life. I had chosen Gang Nong deliberately. Not too remote. Remote draws attention in its own way. Not too urban. Cities have too many cameras, too many people who recognize faces from financial newspapers. A coastal city of moderate size, the kind of place where a quiet, professionally employed man raising a child alone becomes simply a neighbor. Ordinary. Invisible. I became Park Ji-ho inside of 2 weeks. Soo-hyun's legal team was thorough. Identity documents, residential history, academic credentials redirected through an international consulting pseudonym. I consulted remotely for biotech firms in Switzerland and the Netherlands under a separate professional alias. I could not stop being a scientist. It was the one thing I refused to surrender entirely. Everything else, the foundation, the board, the name, the life, I left behind like rooms I had locked and would not re-enter. What I kept, my mind, my work, and Daehyun. He was born in October, 7 months after I disappeared. I will not describe that night in detail because some things belong only to the person who lived them. What I will say is that I was alone in a private clinic under my assumed name, with one nurse who had been vetted by Soo-hyun and who asked no questions, and that when Daehyun finally arrived, small and furious and unmistakably alive, I held him and felt something shift permanently in my internal architecture. He had Daehyun's brow line from the very first day. That specific, slightly severe set to the forehead that I had watched across dinner tables and boardrooms and in the dark of early mornings. It was disorienting. It was also, in the quiet of that room, a strange comfort. Like proof that something real had existed. That I had not imagined the whole of it. I established the rule early, no searching for news about Daehyun. No monitoring HN group announcements. No reading anything that would make the distance feel negotiable. Soo-hyun enforced it from his end by refusing to volunteer information. It was the only way I could function without fracturing completely. I broke the rule once. Year 2. Daehyun was 14 months old and had just begun pulling himself upright against the furniture, deeply pleased with his own engineering, and I was exhausted and unguarded and I opened a news browser without fully deciding to. The headline was immediate. Front page of 3 separate financial publications. Han Group Chairman dismantles Kong Media Empire in landmark hostile acquisition. Sources cite personal grievance. I read the article twice. Then the analysis piece beneath it. Then the statement from Kang Seo-yeon's legal team, which was careful and defeated in the way that statements from people who have lost everything tend to be. Broadcast licenses stripped. Real estate portfolio absorbed. Political alliances severed. The Kong family name reduced, in the span of 18 months, from a dynasty to a footnote. Daehyun had burned it all down. Methodically. Completely. With the particular efficiency of a man who was not angry but something colder and more permanent than anger. I closed the browser. I picked Daehyun up from the floor where he was still conducting his furniture experiments. I sat in my kitchen in Gang Nong while the sea wind pressed against the windows and I did not move for almost 2 hours. The threat was gone. Seo-yeon had nothing left. A woman with no assets, no leverage, and no political cover gains nothing from resurrecting a dead man. The hunt was over. Could go back. I sat with that fact and waited for it to feel like relief. It didn't. Because by then something else had calcified in the space where the decision should have been simple. Daehyun was 14 months old. Daehyun did not know he existed. And I had spent 14 months learning how to be a person without the name Lee Soobin, without the bond humming warmly at the edges of my awareness, without any of it, and the idea of reassembling that, of walking back into a life I had staged a death to leave, of looking Daehyun in the eye and explaining not just the disappearance but the child. I didn't know how. I genuinely did not know how to do that. So I stayed. And hated myself quietly for it, the way you hate yourself for a decision you keep making every single day. What I did not know, what I would only learn much later, in pieces, like evidence assembled after the fact, was what those 5 years looked like from the other side. Soo-hyun told me some of it eventually, in careful installments, as though he was managing my dosage. The rest I learned from Daehyun himself, later, in a kitchen in Gang Nong with the sea outside and 5 years of silence finally breaking open between us. Daehyun had not moved on. Not remotely. He kept my private office in the HN building locked and unchanged. He stopped sleeping in our home within months. The space, apparently, became unbearable, and began working and sleeping at his office headquarters instead. His board grew quietly alarmed. His younger brother Han Juno staged 2 separate interventions that Daehyun attended and then ignored entirely. He refused to sever the bond. His cardiologist flagged it in year 1, then year 2, then sent a formal written warning in year 3. A sustained half-active bond in an unmated alpha causes progressive autonomic dysfunction, the body working against itself, the biological connection straining towards something it cannot reach. It was medically, slowly destructive. Daehyun's response to his cardiologist's written warning was apparently a single line, noted in the file. When Soo-hyun told me this, I had to leave the room. I stood in my hallway in Gang Nong and pressed my back against the wall and breathed carefully, the way you breathe when something hits a place you thought had hardened past feeling. He was keeping himself tethered to something he believed was gone, at cost to his own body, because he was not ready to let the last part of me go. I had left to save a life. He had stayed and quietly endangered his own. There was a twist I did not see coming, delivered through Soo-hyun in year 4 with the particular flatness of someone conveying information they have been holding too long. Han Juno, Daehyun's younger brother, whom I had always liked, who had the same intensity as Daehyun but wore it more lightly, had found out I was alive. Year 2. He had noticed inconsistencies in the bond dissolution records that a non-alpha wouldn't catch, had done his own quiet investigation, and had arrived at the truth through sheer familial stubbornness. He told no one. Not Daehyun. Not his family. What he did instead, he routed anonymous financial transfers to an account connected to Soo-hyun's network. Quarterly. For 3 years. Enough to cover Rayhan's medical expenses, schooling, and a portion of the clinic costs from his birth. 3 layers of shell companies. Untraceable unless you knew exactly what to look for. He had been taking care of us in the only way he could without destroying his brother's fragile stability with the truth. I sat with that for a long time. It was my own brilliance that ended the hiding. In year 5 I published a research paper through my Swiss pseudonym, a methodology on protein folding sequencing in omega-specific cellular repair. I was careful with the framing. I changed the structural presentation. I adjusted the citation style. But I could not change how I think. The argument's architecture was mine. The specific way I move through a scientific problem, the particular sequence of logic I use when building toward a conclusion, apparently that is as identifiable as a fingerprint to someone who has read everything you have ever written. I found this out when Daehyun arrived in Gang Nong on a Tuesday in March. He had driven himself. No security. No announcement. Just a man in a dark coat standing across the street from Rayhan's school, watching me button our son's jacket in the cold afternoon air. I turned around and he was there. And every calculation I had made, every careful, necessary, survival-driven decision of the last 5 years, met his face and simply collapsed. I had rehearsed this moment approximately 1,000 times. Not deliberately. It happened in the spaces between things, while waiting for Rayhan's school bell, while reviewing research papers at midnight, while standing in the shower letting the water run cold because I had forgotten to move. My mind would construct the scenario unbidden, Daehyun finding me, what his face would look like, what I would say, how I would hold myself together long enough to say it. None of my rehearsals were remotely useful. He was across the street when I first saw him, standing completely still in a dark coat, hands at his sides, watching me crouch down to button Rayhan's jacket against the March cold. I didn't see him immediately. I was focused on Rayhan, who was complaining about the collar being too tight, doing that specific squirming protest that required my full attention. When I finally straightened and turned around, my eyes found him the way they always had, like a compass finding north regardless of how far you've carried it. My body understood before my mind did. My hands went cold. My chest locked. He looked the same. That was the first irrational thought. 5 years, and Han Daehyun looked exactly the same, except for something around his eyes that had not been there before. A particular kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. Rayhan tugged my hand. Yama, can we get fish cakes? Go wait by the gate, I said. My voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. Right by the gate, don't move. He went. Daehyun crossed the street. We stood 2 meters apart on an ordinary pavement in Gang Nong and looked at each other for what felt like a very long time. He has my face, Daehyun said. Not an accusation. A statement delivered in the careful, controlled tone of a man who is holding something enormous very tightly. Daehyun. How old is he? Please. Not here. Not on the street. How old? His voice didn't rise. It never rose. It just became more precise, which was somehow worse. I said. He's 4. He closed his eyes. Just briefly, 3 seconds, maybe 4. When he opened them, something had shifted in their depth, something that looked uncomfortably close to a man recalculating every year of his life backwards from this moment. You were pregnant when you left. Yes. You were already carrying my child and you staged your death and drove away. Yes. The word landed between us like something irretrievable. Because it was. We went inside. Rayhan ate fish cakes at the kitchen table with the focused contentment of a 4-year-old entirely unaware that his world was restructuring itself around him. I put the kettle on because I needed something to do with my hands. Daehyun sat at my kitchen table, Han Daehyun in my Gang Nong kitchen, in the small ordinary life I had built from the wreckage of ours, and watched our son eat, and said nothing for several minutes. Then Rayhan looked up at him with Daehyun's own eyes and said, "You smell like Iyama's old things." Something crossed Daehyun's face so quickly I almost missed it. He looked at me. I looked at the kettle. I put Rayhan to bed at 8. It took longer than usual because he wanted 3 stories instead of 1 and I lacked the emotional fortitude to negotiate. When I came back to the kitchen, Daehyun was standing at the window, looking at the dark sea, and the argument that followed was the most honest and the most painful conversation of my entire life. "You let me identify a body," he said without turning around. "You let me stand at a grave. I know what I did. Do you?" Now he turned. 5 years, Soobin. I kept that bond active for 5 years because it never fully severed and I knew that meant something. My cardiologist told me I was destroying my own health. I told him to note it in the file. Because I was not ready to accept that you were gone when everything in me said you weren't. That broke something in me that I had believed was already fully broken. There was a second message, I said. An intercepted communication from inside my recovery room. She had already planned the next attempt. I was still a target, Daehyun. A visible, living, bonded target. Then you should have told me. You were hiding the investigation from me. You knew her name and you said nothing. What was I supposed to think? That I was protecting you. I didn't know that. My voice cracked on the last word. You went silent. The way you always go silent. And I was lying in a hospital bed having lost our child and you were making decisions without me again, and I thought, I stopped. You thought I was protecting her, he said quietly. I thought it was possible. And I hated myself for thinking it. But I couldn't unthink it. The silence that followed was different from his usual silences. This one had texture. The quality of 2 people finally standing in the actual ruins of something instead of pretending the structure was still intact. Then came the twist that dismantled me completely. 3 days after Daehyun arrived, Soo-hyun came to Gang Nong. He and Daehyun occupied the same space with the careful tension of two men who had been carrying the same secret from opposite ends. It was Soo-hyun who finally placed the audit report on my kitchen table, the one his team had completed 18 months ago and that he had been deciding how to deliver ever since. I read it slowly. Dr. Park In-seong, my research director. The man I had trusted with the pregnancy before I trusted my own mate. The financial records were meticulous. A catastrophic personal debt tied to controlled investment funds, called in suddenly, and one transaction made in response. One piece of information sold to resolve it. He had told Seo-yeon about the pregnancy. Park had. The man who had smiled at me every morning for 6 years, who had adjusted my schedule without question, who had expressed such careful, genuine grief at my foundation's memorial service. The leak had never been near Daehyun. It had come from inside my own circle. From my trust, not his silence. I set the report down. I looked at Daehyun across the table. He looked back. And in his eyes I saw that he had known this for some time and had waited, had let me arrive at it myself, had not used it as ammunition in a single argument, because he understood that some truths need to be received, not delivered. You knew, I said. Soo-hyun told me 2 days ago. You didn't say anything. It wasn't mine to say. I pressed my hands flat on the table and breathed. All of it rearranged itself. The timeline, the logic, the unbearable architecture of 5 lost years. He had not been protecting Seo-yeon. He had been protecting me from information he wasn't certain of yet. And I had run from a betrayal that had never come from his direction. We had been undone by a third person's cowardice and our own inability to speak plainly to each other. We were so close, I said. Not to him specifically. To the room. To the years. We were so close to just talking. Daehyun said nothing. He reached across the table and placed his hand over mine, not gripping, not claiming, just present, and left it there. Outside, the sea moved against the shore in the dark, indifferent and continuous. Inside, for the first time in 5 years, I did not feel entirely alone in the knowing of things. Daehyun took a property 3 minutes away and did not ask for anything. That was the first change I noticed. Not dramatic, no grand declarations, no demands dressed as requests. He simply established a radius and stayed within it, like a man who understood that proximity was all he had earned so far and was willing to let that be enough. For Han Daehyun, a man whose entire life had been built around total authority, that restraint was not small. I catalogued it quietly and said nothing. The second change, he learned Rayhan's schedule. Not from me. He watched, noted, and adjusted. He knew which mornings Rayhan wanted his eggs sliced versus scrambled. He knew the name of the stuffed bear that had to be positioned facing the door at bedtime or sleep became impossible. He knew that Rayhan processed big feelings through drawing, and that if the drawings became very dark in color it meant something had upset him and he needed quiet company rather than questions. He learned all of this in 3 weeks without being taught. The same focused intelligence he applied to corporate strategy and geopolitical risk turned entirely toward one 4-year-old boy. I watched from the periphery and felt something I had no clean name for. The bond treatment happened in week 4. My condition, stated once, not negotiated, was that I would be present. Daehyun agreed without hesitation, which itself told me something about how much he had changed or perhaps how much he had always been willing to change and simply never been asked to demonstrate it. We sat in a private cardiac clinic in a city between Gang Nong and Seoul. The procedure was not surgical, a specialized hormonal stabilization protocol designed to repair the autonomic damage caused by 5 years of a half-active, unreciprocated bond pull. His cardiologist reviewed the scans with the particular expression of a medical professional who has been ignored for years and is choosing not to say "I told you so" only out of professionalism. The damage was real. Measurable. His heart had been working against its own rhythm for 5 years, straining toward a bond signal that was deliberately suppressed on my end. I sat in the chair beside the treatment bed and looked at the imaging results and felt a cold, specific fury, not at Daehyun, but at myself, at Seo-yeon, at the entire sequence of events that had led to this image of his heart on a screen looking like something that had been asked to carry too much for too long. You are extraordinarily lucky the bond held, his cardiologist said. Daehyun looked at me across the room. Yes, he said. I am. I looked away first. My eyes were doing something embarrassing and I refused to let it happen in a clinical setting. Seoyeon's letter arrived on a Thursday. No return address. Handwritten, which surprised me. I had expected something more architectural from her, more constructed. Instead, the handwriting was almost plain. The letter of a woman who had stopped performing. She did not apologize. I had not expected her to. What she did instead was explain, with the cold, organizing clarity of someone who had made peace with their own choices and wanted the record to reflect accuracy before they disappeared entirely from relevance. She had known about both pregnancies before the first attempt. The compound had been calibrated with full awareness that a very early secondary implantation existed. The intention had not been selective. It had been total. Rayhan's survival was not mercy. It was a calculation error in her private lab, an incorrect gestational estimate that had set the compound's parameters 3 days too early. My son was alive because someone had made a mistake in a spreadsheet. I read that paragraph 4 times. Then I folded the letter, walked to the kitchen sink, and burned it over the drain. I watched it until there was nothing left. Then I called my brother. I need Seoyeon to understand something, I said. My voice was very calm. Quietly. Through whatever channel you think is appropriate. If she surfaces, anywhere, for any reason, the Lee family will finish what Daehyun started. I have enough network left to make that a credible statement. Soo-hyun was quiet for a moment. Then, there he is. Don't, I said. I've been waiting 5 years for that version of you to come back. Send the message, Soo-hyun. He sent it. I never heard from her again. Han Juno arrived unannounced on a Saturday morning, which told me Daehyun hadn't known he was coming. I opened the door to find him standing there with the particular expression of a man who is prepared to be shouted at and has decided it's worth it. I stepped aside and let him in. Rayhan immediately attached himself to Juno's leg, having decided within 30 seconds that this new tall person was entertaining. Juno, to his credit, adapted immediately, crouching down and engaging with complete seriousness about whatever Rayhan was explaining about his drawing collection. I made tea. Daehyun arrived 12 minutes later, having apparently felt through the bond that something was happening at my address. He walked in, saw his brother, and stopped. You knew, Daehyun said. Not loudly. The quiet version, which was always more serious. Year 2, Juno said, standing. I found the bond inconsistency records. I did my own search. You knew he was alive for 3 years and you said nothing to me. You were barely functional as it was. I made a judgment call. That was not your call to make. No, Juno said evenly. It wasn't. And I made it anyway because I love you and I didn't know what the truth would do to you without more to go on. The silence between them was the specific silence of two brothers navigating something that has no clean resolution. I stayed in the kitchen doorway and let them have it. Daehyun didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, The money you sent. Quarterly. Yes. You took care of them. Someone had to. Another silence. Then Daehyun crossed the room and gripped his brother's shoulder, brief, hard, the closest he had ever come in front of me to saying thank you in a way that meant you kept something alive that I couldn't. Juno stayed for dinner. Rayhan made him sit in the good chair. The nightmare came 3 weeks later. I woke at 2 a.m. with my hand pressed flat against my own sternum. The room was dark. Gang Nong was quiet. I lay there and breathed and waited for the residual fear to metabolize, the way it usually did. My phone lit up on the nightstand. A single message from a number 3 minutes away, sent at 2:03 a.m. I'm here. No question. No request. No demand for confirmation that I was all right. Just the plain, undecorated fact of his presence, offered without condition into the dark. I stared at it for a long time. 2 words. From a man who had historically expressed everything except the thing that needed saying. 2 words that were not grand and required nothing from me in return. I typed back, I know. I meant it as geography. I also meant it as something larger and less easily named, An acknowledgement that landed somewhere deep in the bond and settled there, warm and tentative, like a signal finding its way home after years of interference. I put the phone down. I did not sleep immediately. But the fear did not come back. Outside, the sea continued its indifferent work against the shore. Inside, very quietly, something that had been braced for 5 years began, just slightly, just carefully, to rest. The conversation about rebonding happened on a Wednesday evening in May. Not planned. Not staged. Daehyun was asleep, the dishes were done, and Daehyun had stayed past his usual hour without either of us acknowledging it. We were sitting at opposite ends of my small sofa with a space between us that had been slowly, imperceptibly narrowing over weeks, not through pressure, but through the natural drift of two people who have stopped actively resisting each other's gravity. He spoke first. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight," he said, looking at his hands. "I just want to say it plainly, because I spent 5 years not saying things plainly and I'm done with that. I want to rebond properly. Deliberately. Not because the existing bond never severed, but because I'm choosing you. With full knowledge of everything." I was quiet for a long time. "Full knowledge includes what I did," I said. "Yes. I staged your grief. I let you keep a bond active that damaged your heart. I hid your son from you for 4 years. Yes," he said again. "And I hid an investigation from you while you were recovering from a loss that was already catastrophic. I made decisions about your safety without consulting you for 2 years. I expressed love in ways that felt like control because I never learned the difference." He paused. "We have a thorough list between us." "We do," I said. "I'm not asking you to forgive the list tonight. I'm asking you to consider that I'd like to spend a significant amount of time making it irrelevant." I looked at him then. At the specific tired honesty in his face that had replaced the sealed, impenetrable composure I had spent 2 years trying to crack. He had learned, somewhere in 5 years of loss, how to look like a person who needed something. It had cost him considerably. It was the most attractive thing I had ever seen him do. "Ask me again in a month," I said. He nodded. No argument. No negotiation. "All right." I went to see Dr. Park in Seong on a Friday morning alone. Soo-hyun had offered to come. Daehyun had offered more forcefully. I told them both no, because this was mine. The reckoning with my own failure of judgment, the conversation that closed the last open wound of the last 5 years. Park's office was smaller than I remembered. He was at his desk when I entered and he stood immediately, and the expression on his face told me he had been waiting for this visit for a long time. Perhaps since the day of my supposed death. Perhaps longer. I set the audit report on his desk. He looked at it without touching it. "My child would have had an older sibling," I said. The room was very quiet. Outside, the sounds of the city continued without concern for what was happening inside this particular office. "I know," he said. His voice was barely functional. "There is nothing I can." "I'm not here for your explanation," I said. "I read the financial records. I understand the mechanism. I even understand the desperation." I paused. "I'm here because I needed you to see that I know. And to know that I'm choosing not to destroy you with it, not because you deserve that grace, but because I'm tired of things being destroyed." He sat down. He looked like a man who had been carrying something for 5 years and had just been told he could put it down, but the weight had changed his posture permanently. I left without waiting for him to respond. He resigned the following morning. I did not feel triumphant. I felt clean, in the hollow way of a wound that has finally been properly treated. 1 month later, almost to the day, Daehyun provided the moment none of us had orchestrated. It was an ordinary Sunday. Daehyun was at the kitchen table helping Daehyun with a puzzle, the complex wooden kind, 40 pieces, a map of the Korean coastline that Daehyun had received for his birthday and approached with Daehyun's exact methodical intensity. I was at the counter reviewing a research document, half present, listening to them without appearing to. Daehyun picked up a puzzle piece, examined it, handed it to Daehyun, and said without preamble or fanfare, "Appa, this one goes on your side." The kitchen went very still. Daehyun did not move for a moment. I kept my eyes on my document and did not move either. The word had arrived mid-sentence, casual and certain, as though Daehyun had been using it privately for some time and had simply decided today was the day it became public. I heard Daehyun place the puzzle piece very carefully on the table. Then I heard him say, in a voice that was doing considerable work to remain level, "Thank you. You're right, it does." I turned to look at the counter. At nothing in particular. My eyes were doing the embarrassing thing again, and I had learned to redirect them when that happened. I heard Daehyun excuse himself quietly. He was gone for 4 minutes. When he came back, his composure was restored. Daehyun had already moved on to the next piece and was directing operations with the confidence of someone who had no idea he had just rearranged the entire architecture of a man's interior world. That night, after Daehyun slept, I found Daehyun on the small back porch looking at the sea. I stood beside him. We were close enough that the bond registered warmth, full and bilateral, 2 signals finding each other properly for the first time in years. "I should have said I was scared," he said. "Every time I went silent, every time I made a decision without you, I should have said, I'm scared of getting this wrong. I'm scared of not being enough. I'm scared that you'll realize you don't need this, don't need me, and I won't survive that conclusion." He exhaled slowly. I didn't know how to say that. So I built walls instead and called them protection. I listened to the sea for a moment. "I should have asked instead of assumed," I said. Every silence I interpreted as indifference was a question I was too proud to ask out loud. I treated leaving as strength when it was partly just fear wearing a rational disguise. "We were terrible at this," he said. "Catastrophically. I'd like to be less terrible. Deliberately. With you." I turned to look at him. He was already looking at me, had been, probably, since I walked out here. In the dark, with the sea behind him and 5 years of honest damage between us, he looked exactly like someone worth the catastrophe. "Ask me the question, Daehyun," I said. He did. Plainly. No performance. "Yes," I said. "Same answer as Geneva. Just with better information this time." The bond settled between us, warm, full, deliberate, like a frequency that had been searching years for the right signal and had finally, unmistakably, arrived. A year later, Daehyun sits between us at dinner and conducts a very serious debate about whether the fish or the rice was more important to the meal. He argues both sides simultaneously, which is entirely Daehyun's debating habit delivered in my vocabulary. We catch each other's eyes over his head. Neither of us speaks. Neither of us needs to. Some things, it turns out, don't need language. They just need time and honesty and the particular stubborn refusal to let go of something real, even when holding it costs everything. Especially then.